Hi everyone. So come on here a few minutes early, just whilst we wait for a few people to join in. And yeah, the idea is to start talking about our topic of the day in about 5 minutes time at 1 o'clock. So feel free to give us a shout, comment if you're watching. Do please get any questions over or any concerns, queries, even sort of stories you want to share, experiences you've had, ping them over. Yeah, what we're really going to be focusing on today is, well, as the topic says, selling a property that's tenanted. And so we're going to be talking about the fact the company, one of the companies I've co-founded, Base Property Specialist, we specialize in the letting sector. We're primarily a lettings and management company, but we do sell, I would say, probably on average about 5 properties a year. And those are almost entirely on behalf of our clients. And they are almost always tenanted properties. So it's a really unique process. That's very kind, Robert. So yeah, it is quite a unique process selling a property with a tenant in there. And we've always been an agency that focuses on balancing the needs of a landlord with balancing the needs of a tenant. And so I think we've learned obviously a lot over the years, and we've developed some quite good sort of ground rules that mean that we maintain a good, healthy tenant relationship. So that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about. Robert, flattery will get you everywhere. Just to show what Robert has said. Robert is not wrong, clearly an expert. So yeah, we're just waiting for a few more people to join us on here. But don't know how everyone's finding it at the moment. Got to say, my Viking blood is not hating these slightly cooler temperatures again, as much as the sunshine's been lovely. Definitely don't feel quite as bad. Bad's not the word, but sat here in my basement room, as you can see, which at times has felt a little bit odd with beautiful beaming sunshine outside. But yeah, how's everyone doing today anyway? How are people coping? It's Thursday, weekend's nearly in sight. Don't really know what a weekend necessarily means anymore. Don't know about everyone else, but I do struggle a little bit to distinguish between weekdays and evenings at the moment. But yeah, it's definitely a bit of a challenge. But definitely signs out there of things, as they roll back the lockdown stuff, definitely signs of life starting to return, not to normality. Whatever that is, new normal, everyone keeps talking about. But, there's definitely more cars on the road. We've definitely seen a marked increase in tenant inquiries, particularly this week. The first couple of weeks, the previous couple of weeks, I have to say we didn't see that surge everyone was reporting. And I think that's largely because that was being seen primarily on the sales side. Julie, thanks for joining us. I haven't changed a bit. That's very kind of you to say, Julie. I think I have. I'm about quite literally twice the man I used to be. But no, glad to have you with us, Julie. But yeah, no, I was just saying, so we didn't see that sort of massive surge of inquiries that a lot of agents reported at the start, sort of 3 weeks ago, when agencies first came out of lockdown. And like I said, I think that was primarily driven by salespeople who'd been waiting. But definitely this weekend seemed to be a sort of watershed moment for tenant inquiries. We saw a ton of tenant inquiries come in over the weekend, and we're getting some sizable inquiries coming in now. And part of that is obviously driven by the fact we do have more stock on our books, I would say, now than in any time I can remember. But yeah, so we've got to 1 o'clock. So I think it's about time that we started on the topic of the day. So thanks for joining me, everyone. I can see comments that you post on here, and I can share them if they're relevant. So do, by all means, please drop in your questions, queries. If you want to query something I'm saying, if there's something particular you'd like me to sort of focus in on, drop it in there, and I can share it on screen and sort of address that. So thanks for joining me today. So we're here to talk about the marketing and selling of tenanted properties. So look, for those of you who've just joined us, as the logo there shows, I'm one of the co-founders at Base Property Specialists. We're a lettings and management focused company, but we've always taken an attitude that we want to try and deliver a balanced service to landlords and tenants. And so any process we come into, any transaction we go through, whatever, we do look at the experience of both sides. And so sales, although it's a smaller part of our business, it accounts for probably about 5 to 10% of our annual revenue. Sales for vendors is a very stressful, very drawn out process as it is. Bring a tenanted property into the mix, and that adds some extra complications and stresses to that as well. But then you've also got to consider the tenant experience. So, I mean, there's been lots of ghastly stories, whether it is the same agent that placed those tenants that is instructed to sell it. I think especially where the tenancy is let and managed by a different agent to the one instructed for sale, there often tends to be very little regard for the consideration of the tenants. And I think as a landlord, you've got to be careful. Whatever reason you're selling for, whether it's out of necessity or whether it is out just a business decision that the time is right to sell, do remember that it is your tenant's home. And I think that's something we state to all of our sellers and landlords is tenants don't just rent a property. Most tenants find a home, and any fluctuation in the security of their position in that home, whether you're serving notice at the end of a tenancy, whether you're putting a property on for sale, where they are occupants, you just need to understand what that can mean to them. I think also when you factor in the challenges of selling a property, regardless of market conditions, the fact that I think it's something like 50 or 60% of properties do not get sold by the first agent that markets them. A lot of transactions, offers get agreed, but then it's very common that transactions fail. I think that is somewhere around the 50, 60% mark as well. So it's really important with all those things that happen, that you consider the impact on your tenants in that. And fundamentally, the approach we've always taken is that not only is it your tenant's home, but that is a vital part of your income. And if you think the average UK sale takes 16 weeks, so give or take 4 months, if you factor in a couple of months marketing time to secure that sale as well, so you're looking at like a 6-month process. Really, you want to do your best to keep your tenant, right? I think for most properties, we obviously work in London. I think our average rent sits around the £2,000 per month mark. So if you're going to readily lose a tenant because of poorly managing this process, potentially you can have your property sit empty for 6, 7, 8 months without that revenue. So you could be talking, 12, 14, 16,000 pounds in lost revenue. And that is something that, you really need to consider. So let's talk about the process from the start. Oh, Julie's coming with a question. Let me just share this up here. If a landlord sells a property that is managed by agent A, is the new owner obliged to use agent A for the management, or can they use any agent of their choice? Tricky one. Julie, fundamentally, the agent's agreement is with the former owner. It's not tied to the property. It's tied to the owner that entered that transaction. So you're not obliged to take up management by that agent. The terms of their contract and the fees they were due lie with the vendor. Now, I think if an agent's clever, they will look at a way to try and win you over if you're not readily willing to sign up with them. But it is absolutely the choice of you, the new owner. If you want to self-manage that property, that is absolutely your right. I mean, all paperwork is going to have to be reissued the moment the ownership changes. So you're going to have to reissue all the tenancy paperwork, prescribed information, deposit registration. Obviously, at that point, you also need to make sure that all the compliance is in place. So you might have had a gas safety that was valid at the point the tenants moved in, but with selling might have expired. They might have not have been on top of it 100%. So just keep an eye on that, because obviously, again, the moment that property becomes yours, you become legally responsible for all of that. So, I think there would often be value in staying with that agent, at least for the remaining term of the existing tenancy. But that would all depend very much on what you think of the agent, what service they're giving so far, et cetera, and whether you're able to agree terms. So I hope that was helpful. So coming back to selling with tenants. So let's start right at the beginning. First and foremost, I think the most important part that lays the groundwork for the whole journey is your communication. And it is about talking with and engaging with the tenants way before you go to market. And when I say way before, it can be a week or two before. But the more advance notice you give them, the better. I think where tenants understandably get panicked is where a landlord or an agent suddenly calls up and goes, oh yeah, we're putting it on the market, or we've been instructed to sell this property. We're coming around tomorrow to photograph it, and then from then we're starting viewings. I think for tenants, that's a bit of a disturbance. So we always make the point of having quite an open dialogue with the tenants at the start. We talk about the realities of selling a property. So we guide them on typically what sort of number of viewings we expect, popular viewing times, et cetera, et cetera. We talk them through the typical time to secure a buyer, the typical process and how long that goes on for selling a property, and the failure or the failure/success rate on those. So we try and give our tenants a really sort of open and candid picture of exactly what's happening. Now, one thing I didn't touch on is obviously the first thing as a landlord you have to do if you're thinking about selling your property is check the terms of your tenancy agreement. Just because you decide to sell does not suddenly mean that you can just rip up the terms of your tenancy agreement, sell the property, sell a property that you had tenants move in 2 months ago and kick them out for new owners to move in and occupy the property. You are bound by the terms of your tenancy agreement. And that doesn't change with a property sale. So, if you're looking to go to market and you've either given or received notice, or you're in the last 2 months of the tenancy agreement, I get it. That's quite easy. But if you're looking to sell a property anytime before that, you really need to talk to your tenants and make sure they understand the process time. Now, that's not to say you can't sell it. If you've got, like I said, if you've got tenants who've been in there, say 2 months on a 12-month lease, and you find yourself in a situation where you need to sell that property for whatever reason, look, talk to your tenants. A contract fundamentally is a mutually agreed binding arrangement, but by mutual consent, you can dissolve that agreement. So if you do find yourself in a situation where, like I said, you absolutely have to sell for whatever reason, talk to your tenants. Most tenants are human. Most tenants, if you're honest and open, will understand and will be quite supportive about that, and you can just say, look, you stay at the property. If you can, you're welcome to stay at the property until I find a buyer. If when I find a buyer, you can accommodate us and move, and be flexible around that. Don't be a stickler about notices and et cetera, et cetera. But it's just about finding that middle ground. So, hi, Charlie. So that's the first point. Look at your contract, look at your terms, then have a discussion with your tenants. Make sure they understand what the sales process is. Now, one of the things we do with our tenants, if if this is prior to notice, obviously if notice has been served, then that sort of frees you up a little bit, because the tenants have obviously then made the decision to vacate the property, or you've made the decision that you're definitely going to secure vacant possession back of that property regardless of securing a buyer first. But I mean, if we market a property any time before the last 2 months of the tenancy, what we will typically do is we will agree with the tenants that we will do restricted viewings, and we do sort of ask for the occasional exception. You will occasionally get a really good buyer who's very fixed, but what we typically say to our tenants is that we will only do viewings on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. And the reason for that being, obviously, Saturday, a weekend viewing can be quite an important part of the marketing strategy. And obviously having a couple of weekdays, but that just gives your tenants peace of mind that, 3 weekdays, they've got total peace and quiet. Sundays, they've got total peace and quiet. It's quite nice for them to have the Sunday and Monday back to back. That isn't set in stone. We have some tenants who are like, oh, can't you just do Thursday, Friday, Saturday? We're always ready to accommodate. With it, like I say, in reason, it is their home. So it's really important that you respect their space. And look to keep them happy. Fundamentally, it's key that you keep a tenant happy, not only for their emotional well-being, but, also for your own benefit. You're going to be asking these tenants and hoping that these tenants ensure that that property is really nicely presented whenever you do come around with a buyer. And then when you get into the nitty-gritty sort of legal process, you're going to want those tenants to be quite accommodating with you, with access for surveyors and whatever else happens during the transaction time, and then obviously to hopefully leave in a timely manner at the end of the process. So again, it just, it all comes back to communication, but that's one of the things that we usually do at the start of the process is we agree with our tenants, at least at the start, to do largely restricted viewings. And we find actually, that creates quite a nice buzz with people who inquire. There will be the very rare exception to the rule, in which, like I said, at which point, you just go to the tenant and ask them to accommodate it. But actually, most people, when you say, oh, look, sorry, we can only get in there on these 3 days of the week, that's usually something that people are willing to accommodate. And if they're serious buyers, as long as the access isn't too restricted, that should never really be a problem. I think the only exception being is if they're teetering on offering on another property and they don't want to lose it and they're desperate to see it. But like I said, that's a perfect opportunity to just pick up the phone to your tenant, explain the situation, see if they can accommodate an unusual viewing. So go through that process, get the tenants on board. Like I said, offering a tenant, at least at the start of the process, a sort of restricted viewing sort of shows that you really respect them and respect their space, and hopefully goes a long way to establishing a good relationship. I think it's fair to say most agents nowadays will get professional marketing materials done. So at base, that will be professional photographs, a floor plan, a virtual tour, and a video tour of the property. So that's a lot of content. Now, again, that's something that we need to have a discussion with our tenants about. Like I said, there's no point us spending hundreds of pounds getting all those marketing materials done if we're going to have a series of photos that have clothes horses everywhere with drying clothes and 3 days worth of washing up sat in the kitchen sink, and lime scale on the shower screens in the bathroom. That's just not going to help us sell a 2-bedroom flat for £800,000. It's not going to be ticking the boxes and really grabbing people's attention online. So again, have that discussion with the tenants. It's important, it is their home and you need to respect that. But at the same time, they need to understand that, you're looking to sell the property, much like when they were looking to rent. And I'm sure most tenants have an aspiration to buy at some time. You can have a quite frank conversation of, would you like to go into a place that looks like, someone's just dashed out the door to go to work or to pop to the shops? Or would you like to walk into somewhere which looks, ready for showing? And I always say to tenants, sometimes jokingly, and it does depend on their age and other profiles as well, but I will quite often say to tenants, just imagine that your parents are coming around, or if you don't really care what your parents think, just imagine if your partner's parents are coming around for dinner, and how you would like the property to look for them to make that best impression, and work with them. Our marketing guy can usually be around. If we contact him today, he can usually be around tomorrow. That isn't going to be agreeable to most tenants. On a day like today, Thursday, I would say if I'm contacting a tenant about that today, the earliest that tenant is probably going to want that photographer in is Monday, because they're probably, they're busy. It's the second last day of the week. They're going to want the weekend, to chill out a little bit, but also that gives them the weekend to really go through the place, give it a clean, give it a tidy, get it all ready for the start of the week and for you to get in there. And, that then gives you the best possible chance of getting some really good marketing assets. Something else I would recommend as well, we don't typically accompany our marketing guy when we're doing our rental properties. But for sales properties like this, again, if they're tenanted, more often than not, we will quite often attend with them. Even if it's so that we're there just for the first 5 to 10 minutes, just to scout around the property and make sure that everything is sort of really how we'd like it. Otherwise, we're there to sort of maybe shuffle a couple of things around, move a couple of things out of shot whilst it's photographed, and then put it back, just to really make sure, you only, once those marketing assets are done and you put them online, that's it. So you really want to make sure that they deliver that punch that you want to, and they look really, really good. So yeah, again, make sure that you're accommodating and understanding with your tenants. And look, don't get frustrated about that. If you have to wait a few days, if you have to wait a week for your photographer, don't get frustrated that you're missing out on marketing time or anything else. There is a lot you can be doing in the interim to get that property ready. So, I would say the most common failing on pretty much any sales listing is not enough work being done on the legal document preparation with the vendor's solicitor to get all that stuff ready and in place. So when you secure a buyer, things can kick off really quickly. Probably the most common delay in getting a transaction from offer forwards is that lack of preparation. So if you do have to wait a little bit, a week or two to get that property just right and on the market, looking the way you want it, like I said, don't feel that's lost time. Don't be frustrated. Use that time, talk to your solicitor, talk to your estate agent. If they're any good, they will know, what are the key things, key documents, key information you really need to be getting locked down and in place and ready to go. So when you find a buyer, you're in the best possible position. What have we got? Hi, Deb. We've got excellent advice here. Oh, it's very kind of you, Deb. So that is all leading up to the preparation of it. So you're now looking, really, when you're selling a tenanted property, you've really got two prospects, right? So you've got the option of selling the property still tenanted to the new owners. Now that could, but quite unlikely, be that they're happy to keep the tenants to see out their contract and then leave before they move in. That's quite unlikely. Typically, that will be another landlord buy-to-let investor looking to pick up that property. And so that's obviously a perfectly viable thing. And that is actually, you're offering them a great property, because rather than an agent guesstimating or upselling the rental yield that a property is going to achieve, a landlord investor can be buying a property that they know exactly what it's returning. They know the contract term. They know that, or their solicitor will make sure that all the compliance and everything is in place. And quite often, furniture, if it's a furnished property, that will quite often be included in the sale, or it has to be, because that's actually part of the tenancy. So it's quite a nice offering to other investors to be able to pick up a tenanted property, which is sort of pre-packaged, turnkey, up and running. As Julie touched on earlier, you might already have a letting agent or managing agent on board. We've done a few transactions over the years where we've had one managed landlord want to sell. And before we've gone to market, we've actually taken that to our whole managed portfolio. And several times we've had one of our existing clients come back to us and go, actually, do you know what? I've been thinking about buying another property. And that's in our price point. The fact that you guys, it's your tenants, you guys manage it, fantastic. And that transaction's been great because there's no emotion to it. It's very much about the numbers. It's very straightforward. And because we're transitioning a property without having to vacate the tenants, that removes a lot of the friction and a lot of the stresses that come with that process. However, obviously, what you have to bear in mind is, that is an investment decision. That is a very sort of clinical decision. So the buyer will typically be looking at one of two sort of benchmarks, and that's either the potential capital growth of the property or the yield which that property achieves through the rental income. Sometimes they'll be looking at a blend of the two, but typically investors tend to have their focus on one of those. And obviously what that means is your rent achieved and everything else that packages that up will typically very much dictate the price of that property. There's very little heart involved in that. It's all head, and it tends to come down to crunching numbers, but it is typically an easier transaction to complete. The other type of transaction, and typically the transaction where you will achieve a higher price for the property, is obviously where you're selling it for someone to make it their own home. And I have to say the vast majority of tenanted properties that we've sold have been to owner occupiers who are looking to move in and make that property their own home. So managing that process is complex, but again, it comes back to what I talked about earlier. It's about communication. Once you find a buyer, if they're an owner occupier buyer, you need to just hold your tenant's hands a little bit through that process. I have to say, to be totally honest, we typically won't be upfront right at the start of a sales process, whether it's an investor or owner-occupier buyer with the tenants at the early stage. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, we don't want to unsettle them early in what is a process that will take 3 to 4 months, and there's a high risk of that transaction actually not getting across the line. That's the main one, really. We don't want them to be unsettled when there's still a long way to go and a lot of variables within that situation. So typically what we will do is we will do the early stages of sort of securing a transaction. So we'll, do all the legally mandated stuff, AML, etc., anti-money laundering, proof of funds, proof of mortgage. We'll verify that solicitors have been fully instructed. We'll get the valuation survey booked in, or structure survey, whatever the buyer needs on that, and we'll usually push that through to the point where we've got a mortgage offer in principle, subject to the due diligence, and that's the point where we'll then start being more candid with our tenants about the situation that we're in. So we'll usually be at that point. We'll usually update the tenants to say, right, subject to the due diligence, we've got over basically sort of the first major hurdle of this transaction going forward, of getting the valuation approved and the basic early documentation facilitated. And, we now go into what can be the more drawn out, frustrating part of the process of gathering reports and et cetera, and inquiries that come off the back of that. So that is typically the point where we'll go to a tenant and we'll say, right, guys, we're at this point. We've got the mortgage offer now, and that will be one of two conversations. So it will be, either fantastic news. This is a landlord buyer. They're looking to complete as soon as possible. They will be. They're obviously mandated to keep you at the same contracted terms. So they'll be keeping you for the duration of your contract. Sometimes we'll have landlords who actually, going into that process, they'll be like, do you know what? If the tenants are happy, I'd like to actually start a new 12-month tenancy agreement, or even do a 2-year tenancy agreement. Sometimes those landlords will want to lock in that security even further. So a tenant that might want a bit more security can sometimes get that time. But yeah, so we'll often say, they're going to take you on. Sometimes we'll know or not whether we're still going to be in the play if we're the managing agent there. And if we are, we tend to reassure tenants of that fact. Quite often that is a reason the tenant rents a property, is because we look after it. And so reassuring them that we stay in the mix and we're going to be there to hold their hand and look after them and look after their home, is quite an important reassurance to them. Or, like I said, alternatively, that's where we'll sort of reveal that we've secured a buyer that is looking to be an owner occupier. And so, again, it's very much about managing that discussion. We will explain to the tenant what that means. We will reiterate what we said 1, 2, 3, 4 months before, about the fact that we've still got probably a good two months to get through to exchange of contracts. And there is a high possibility that for a multitude of reasons that might not go forward. So what we'll usually do with the tenants there is we'll just say to them, look, we'll keep them regularly updated with major progresses, less so with when we've got a landlord buyer, because the reality is, there's not too much concern for them. So when a landlord's buying, we tend not to keep the tenants too informed, because fundamentally on a day-to-day basis, it doesn't really make any difference to them. Just at some point, the paperwork's going to get reissued with a new landlord name on it. So yeah, so the communication burden is less so when there's an investor involved. But with a homeowner, we'll very much try to keep those tenants updated. I would say typically on sort of a 2-week basis, if there aren't any major steps through that. And then to manage that process for the landlords. Now, this is always a slight sort of balancing act, because we always take the approach, as we touched on before, we ideally we want to try and keep those tenants in that property for as long as possible, which is often not what solicitors will want if it's an owner-occupiers. Solicitors, fundamentally, you're paying them to hope to prepare for the worst. And so what they will be looking at is, okay, so there's a property, there's a tenancy in there. Who's to say those tenants are going to move out? They all sorts of myriad of things could go. But, what happens if that tenant refuses to vacate the property and therefore my client can't proceed and purchase? And that will very much be something niggling at the back of your solicitor's mind if you're a purchaser. I think that has particularly been accentuated in the current climate with the fact that there are no evictions possible at the moment. That will and the postponement of evictions is creating an ever bigger pipeline. So the reality is, I think if you needed to start an eviction process now, I would be amazed if you got that tenant evicted before the end of this year. So solicitors will have this at the back of their mind. So it's really important that you reassure them about the fact that you've been open and honest with the tenants, about the fact that they understand. They still won't take it as black and white, because they'll know the rights that tenants have to protect them, and the fact that a tenant can ultimately choose to just stay in situ until removed through a legal route. But yeah, so it's always good to sort of reassure the buyer, and particularly their solicitor. I've had a lot of buyers get very scared, having us talked a lot with them through the process. When they then get to the solicitor stage, the solicitor absolutely scares the bejesus out of them about getting stuck with a sitting tenant or not being able to complete and losing all the fees and time and everything else that it's taken. So it's really important that you educate the buyer about that you communicate with the buyer's solicitor to make sure that the tenants are informed. I often find it's quite nice just to get an email that has all the tenants included in it from one of them saying, we get it, the property's up for sale, we understand you're looking to hopefully exchange around this period, and we'll be looking to vacate the property as close to that date as possible. And then the final challenge that you come to is obviously, if you've got a tenanted property as a landlord, if the tenants are paying rent monthly, if you want them to leave, you have to give them legally a minimum of 2 months notice. Now, if you wait until you get exchange ready, which typically you're probably talking, if you're lucky, 2 months, otherwise you're probably 3+ months past the point of offer. Obviously then having to wait another 2 months for those tenants to leave, that's going to put quite a lot of stress on a buyer. That's going to be quite stressful for you. So again, really important that you talk to your tenants early doors. Really important that you let them know that, it can be quite nice if you've got a good relationship with your tenants. I would approach them and ask them to give notice to you as a tenant. They can give you 1 month's notice. rather than you giving them 2. So if you've got a tenant that's more accommodating like that, that can obviously halve the legal timeline. And outside of that, I would just recommend that you really support those tenants. I wouldn't personally hold them to any notice period when you get to that stage or close or approaching exchange. That's really when you want to make your tenants' lives easy. So, we will usually say to our clients, tenants, look, guys, you find a property, we'll release you around that date. If you want to move in on the 21st of June, and you want to have this property till the 23rd of June just to facilitate that move, great. We'll release you on the 23rd of June. We'll refund any pro rata rent that you've paid beyond that date. We're not going to be sticklers about contract terms. We're not going to make it difficult, because at that point, again, really you just want those tenants out. And again, you want to make that process for them as easy as possible. And I've known vendors and agents do other things just to make that process easy. I've known people offer to pay for professional moving services just to make the tenants' lives a little bit easier. I will often have a chat with the tenant, early doors, and find out what kind of property, where they're looking to move on to. If it's something we have in our portfolio, perfect opportunity to line up another deal with a tenant you already know and have a relationship with. So look at that. But if we can't find something, I'll talk to agents I know and go, oh, look, guys, these guys are probably going to have to move out in about 2 months' time, and this is what they're looking for. Let me know if you've got anything come up in your books. And again, anything we can do to sort of massage that journey for tenants and really make the whole process as easy and seamless as possible ultimately just feeds back into making your life as a sales agent and as a owner seller of that property. It's just going to really, really help you. Julie, what have we got here? If it is a private sale with no agent, what notices should be served on the tenant to allow the new owner to be their new legal landlord? Good question, Julie. I'm going to say, do you know what? I'm not entirely sure what notice is required with regards to the transition. Now, I would probably default to say that, as a landlord, if you're taking your rent monthly, you've got to give 2 months notice to terminate. So I would probably take that as a guide. 2 months notice to your tenants of that process is probably going to be the best way to go about that. But fundamentally, I think everything I've been saying is just about that communication stage. So as long as what the tenants are tied into isn't changing, as long as they're not being forced into an extended contractual term or anything like that, most tenants shouldn't really fundamentally have any issues or reservations with a transitioning of landlord. And whether that happens in a week's time or a month's time or 2 months' time, it shouldn't fundamentally make any difference. The tenants are still bound by the same or similar contract terms. Fundamentally, all that's changed is the name on the landlord document. Now, obviously, if it is a private let, as you've touched on, now the tenants might have opted for that property based on how they got on with the private landlord, just as much as how much they like the property. I think that can be quite common, especially for tenants who've had a bad experience in the past. They tend to focus on who the landlord / managing agent is almost as much as what the property's like. So that might be a friction point. If they picked it for you, they might want to just sort of meet the new landlord. But again, there's nothing wrong with that. Again, building that relationship up, introducing the new buyer to the existing tenants as early as possible. I can't see anything wrong with that. They're going to have a relationship going forwards. So the sooner they meet each other and the earlier, when there's a few as possible sort of implications, restrictions, stresses on that situation, is the best time to do it. So yeah, that's my best attempt at answering that question, Julie. Hope that kind of helped. So really, that's fundamentally it. It's just about really having an open dialogue with your tenants throughout that process, making sure they understand the process, the timeline, the stresses, what can go right, what can go wrong, what it means to them. If you are successful and you do get to that exchange and completion stage, fundamentally at that point, everyone just wants everything to happen as quickly as possible, or at least the buyer and seller do, and their solicitors. But just don't lose sight of the tenants in that when you're that close and you're just about to get across the line. Like I said, that's where you can really be helpful. That's where, and it depends on the property you're selling and why you're selling and what you achieve for it. I appreciate there are a lot of mitigating factors, but if there are things you can do to help your tenants, if they've got to move, if you can pay for a man and van just to make that a little bit easier, or maybe they're meant to pay for a professional clean, but you say to them, guys, don't worry about it, we'll get the professional clean done before we hand it over. It's one less thing you need to worry about. It's always just nice to do a little something to sort of end that relationship well. My business partner, Anne, has come in with a killer. You can inform the tenant via a section 48 of the new landlord's details through, although preferably you would issue new paperwork. So there we go. Answer given. Anne, is there any notice requirement? Like, do you have to, for section 48, do you have to give like at least a month's notice of that or anything? I know that was what Julie was asking. But there you go. You can issue a section 48. I have just learnt something new. But yeah, typically, I know in the transactions we've done, we've always done new paperwork. We just feel that's sort of the most robust way to make sure that everything is right. All the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, and et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, so really that's it, guys. Hopefully that has been helpful. I think there's probably going to be quite a lot of landlords thinking about selling at the moment. The impact that has been felt so far on the rental market, I think, there's been a little bit of impact on it, but truth be told, I think we've got some more impacts to come. There is a shift in the market in terms of stock. Obviously, the short-term market has very much disappeared over the last few weeks, obviously with no international flights. So that's brought a lot more stock into the market. I do think towards the end of the year, and as furlough starts to wind down, we are going to see a lot more redundancies and a lot more businesses folding, and that will in turn have an impact on the market. So, I think there will be a lot of landlords looking at their options. And I think if you're going to sell, probably right now is the moment to get your property on the market and test the market, see if you can secure a buyer before things start to turn for the worse, which I think a lot of us are expecting towards the end of the year. So it's probably a good time to test the market, see if you can secure a seller, if that's the right exit route for you now. And then, if that doesn't work out in the next 2 to 3 months, lock in a really good tenant and ride that out. And if you are going to do that, just the other little tip, not relevant to the topic of today, but I would strongly recommend any landlord placing any tenancies now and for the foreseeable future, make sure that you've got guarantors and or rent warranties in place on all of your tenancies. There's going to be a very volatile employment environment for the foreseeable future, and you want to make sure that you're in a really good, strong and secure position. And with evictions not being possible, it's really important that you protect yourself. So I would strongly recommend that any landlord placing a tenancy really for the foreseeable future and until things start to really turn a corner, should absolutely make sure you have either a guarantor or a rent warranty, or you can go belt and braces and go both, and then you're definitely covered. But that's it for me. I'm starting to waffle on, so I'm now going to sign off. Hopefully that was helpful. And my partner has come back to answer that. As long as no section is served, rents remain due to previous owner. So the quicker, the better. So there we go. All right, so hopefully that was helpful. If you missed any part today, this will be made available as a recording shortly, and you can watch this back in full. But thank you all for your time. Thank you for joining us. And yeah, keep following Agents Here to Help. We've got some more content coming in the next few days. I think we're doing another broadcast in about a week's time, talking about the importance of inventories within tenancies. And yeah. And if there's any other content you want, get in touch, drop us emails, send us questions, queries, topics you'd like to cover. We've got agents all over the country, very keen to share their knowledge and expertise with you. But otherwise, thank you for your time. Everyone have a good day and roll on the weekend.